Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, building off of the prior verse where we saw the stipulations that God put in place regarding the shedding of blood. We're going to see more elaboration on that here as well. Ha ekeon hema anthropu. Anti tu hematas altu enkuthesetai. Hati in ekani theou epoiesatan anthropon. Now, this last bit, the syntax is pretty straightforward, but the first bit is pretty interesting. This clause, as we'll see here in a second, is considered a nominative absolute. Now, you're probably more familiar with genitive absolutes. That is, the genitive participle sets up a clause that introduces the topical frame of reference but is not grammatically related to the main line. It's kind of doing its own thing. This is a much less common version of that uses the nominative. Let me explain what I mean. We start with this substantival participle that's from ekeo. It's a nominative singular masculine present active participle. It means to pour out. And notice it's substantivized here. So the one who pours out, and then the object here is hema, so this is your accusative. The one who pours out blood of a man. In other words, the one who maybe murders someone or sheds his blood in some way. And then it just sort of floats by itself. That thought doesn't continue. It just establishes a certain frame of reference. And basically the same is true in the Hebrew. Instead, what we have as the main sentence is kind of this interesting prepositional phrase, anti, which in this case I'm going to take as in return for, something like that. It can also mean in place of, in return for. To hematos, in return for the blood of him. So that's the anthropos in the prior clause. So in return for this blood of this man who's been killed, then your main verb is ekuthesetai. It's the same verb, ekeo. But in this case, it's a third singular future passive indicative. You see that thesetai ending. And so that's why this is considered a nominative absolute construction, because this subject here, this nominative participle, is not the subject of this clause. Instead, it's an unexpressed, essentially, subject. This third singular is basically the blood of this guy. The blood of the bloodshed will be poured out. And so that's why it's not exactly syntactically connected. In other words, in place of the blood of this guy, the blood of the ekeoer, if you will be shed. So it's really quite interesting syntax, but it just takes a second to kind of process it all. Now we have an explanatory hati. Actually, before we get into that, the Masoretic has by man his blood will be shed. And I see the Adam, so by man, Damo, blood, his blood, Yishvok will be poured out. So fair enough. And so the hexapla in some manuscripts will add an in anthropo somewhere with the asterisks in the margin there to express this by man that the Old Greek doesn't have, because he essentially just collapsed it into this anti kind of construction. So that's kind of interesting. Now we have an explanatory hati, because, or something like that, in a kani. So in the image, if you remember that verb from a long time ago, in Genesis 1, of God, epoiesa. Now this is pretty interesting, because epoiesa here is going to be the first singular aorist active indicative. I made man. We have God as the one who is speaking here. Directly, that's a first singular. The Masoretic has he made, and so there's not a great explanation for that other than perhaps the Genesis translators trying to make clear that from verses 5 all the way through verse 7, including this verse, God is the one who is speaking. And so instead of having him refer to God in the third person, as we have in the Masoretic, the translator just makes it God himself as in I, speaking here to clarify it. So that's kind of an interesting little tweak that the translator makes. It's worth pointing out this bloodshed for bloodshed. This is, in a sense, a rudimentary form of lex talionis, kind of eye for an eye, that gets further codified, say, in Leviticus. To go back to Genesis, because I already mentioned it, this idea of in the image of God, I made man, that is a direct reference back to Genesis 1:26, poiesum and anthropon, kat ekona hemeteron, so let us make man according to our image. Also in Genesis 5:1, which was kind of a summary, God made Adam, which is man, in the image of God, he made him. And so once again, not to continue reiterating this, but it's a really important point to make, that Genesis 9 in so many different ways is going back to Genesis 1, 2, etc., prior stages of the original creation account, to establish some of the parameters of this recreative scene post-flood. So again, just a beautiful connection there back to earlier stages of Genesis. Thank you very much for following along today.